to say that the supernatural never really happens. In other parts of the world, it happens so much that the average person would be silly to deny it. And it makes sense. Like, if demons are real, it would make sense for them to do that. Here's why. The biggest problem, the biggest threat to Christianity in the West is atheism, basically. Secular atheism is a big threat to the West. So if demons started manifesting themselves powerfully in the West, everyone would run to church, which is not what the demons want, because, you know, the West is a historically Christian land. By the way, if atheists are... I already can hear the atheists typing in all caps in the comment section. I'm just saying, from a Christian perspective, it would make sense that demons would manifest themselves more in non-historically Christian lands than historically Christian lands. I think you can at least agree with that, if you assume Christianity is true, which I know you don't. I'm just saying, that does explain to me, as a Christian, why people of other cultures like the Caribbean, where there's like voodoo and stuff, why they have much more personal experiences with the demonic than in the West. So evidentialism, it can work, and there's also evidence of some other things, like some people try to look for evidence of like Noah's flood or whatever. I don't know. I'm not that into that stuff, because like I said, someone's salvation shouldn't depend on their ability to dig through historical documents. That's also kind of why I'm not convinced by the arguments for Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy being the one true church, by the way, because they both have like equally convincing historical arguments. So at the end of the day, from their perspective, someone's salvation depends on their ability to privately judge which historical arguments have more weight. The next one is personal experience. Now, this is kind of the biggest reason I believe in God. One of the two. This, plus another one I'm going to get to, is the biggest reason I believe in God. Like, I've personally experienced things that are unexplainable without God. But that's not going to convince anyone else. Personal experience is very good for convincing oneself that God exists, but very bad for convincing anyone else, because it's personal. No one can step into the shoes of someone else's personal experience. So I would say it's C tier. I'm surprised Genetically Modified Skeptic put it in A tier. Maybe he was doing that. Maybe he was doing that in order to say, like, the best arguments that religious people have are from personal experience, but I don't think that's true. Okay, so now we get into B tier. So, the moral argument I put in B tier. I think the moral argument is a pretty good argument. I think most atheist philosophers would agree that morality is not objective if God does not exist. And even if atheists may claim that morality is subjective, almost nobody really believes it. Almost everyone has this sense and lives as if morality is objective. Now, just because belief in God can epistemologically justify objective morality, that doesn't mean religious people will always agree on what's moral. The atheist could say that Christians have disagreed on slavery, which they absolutely have. Christians have disagreed on many moral issues. Religious people of all kinds have disagreed on moral issues. But if you believe in God, you at least have a foundation to say morals are objective, and therefore we can impose morals on other people. The moral argument is basically, you know, because people on Earth disagree what right and wrong is, then can something be objectively right or wrong? The only way it can be objectively right or wrong is if there is supreme authority, which is what we would call God. Like, in a culture, like, let's say 90% of a culture believes it is good and right to horribly persecute the 10%. You would have the majority agreeing on a certain moral value. Would that make it right? Most people instinctively would say no. So I think the moral argument is a pretty good argument for God. Now, the atheist could say that, yes, even if we feel like morality is objective, that doesn't mean it's true. Like, one of the fallacies, or maybe it's one of the cognitive biases, is like a just world hypothesis. Just because, like, we feel it ought to be true doesn't mean it is true. And they have a good point there. Next is from consciousness. Now, I went over in my video about the arguments for God. Consciousness and the experience of being, you know, just aware is irreducible. You cannot study it scientifically. Now, it is God of the gaps. When you try to use God or the supernatural, I don't think this is really an argument for God. I think it's more an argument for the human soul. It is God of the gaps if you try to use something supernatural to fill in the gaps of what science hasn't discovered yet. But consciousness is something that science, by definition, cannot answer. It's not just that science does not yet have an answer to human consciousness, it's that science cannot answer the question of human consciousness. yes, science can study the brain, and science can study the brain chemicals, that brain chemicals correlate to feeling certain things or experiencing certain things, but those chemicals are not the same as the experience of that thing itself. Here's why science cannot analyze consciousness. You can only observe your own consciousness. You cannot observe anyone else's consciousness. For all you know, you could be a solipsist. For all you know, you might be the only person who exists, because you cannot observe anyone else's consciousness. And science depends on observation. The scientific method depends on being able to observe things. So science cannot say anything about that which we cannot observe. And that is why science cannot answer the question of consciousness. So you could just say it's a mystery, but the only way to answer the question of consciousness is with some sort of supernatural metaphysical system that goes beyond what science itself can say.
Wands at the ready. Your Hawkwand summons have arrived. Step into the wizarding world with this stunning limited edition metal poster, shimmering with a golden finish and 3D printed details. Can you spot all the hidden references from the Harry Potter saga? Only 1,700 copies available. Accept your invitation now only at display.com.
Alright, now in A tier, we have the transcendental argument. This is articulated pretty well by people like Jay Dyer, some of those Orthodox people, Eastern Orthodox. It's presuppositionalism, which is common in some parts of the Reformed tradition, is pretty similar to this. It basically says, when people just think logically, there are a lot of assumptions they take for granted that they can't prove. Like, people assume that there is uniformity in nature. People assume that truth exists. There's a lot of assumptions that people make that they can't prove. You can't prove that truth exists. That's impossible. So, these unproven assumptions make a lot more sense in a worldview where God exists and all of reality is upheld by the mind of God than in a worldview where God does not exist, and these assumptions are just human assertions that they're assuming without evidence. So that's basically a transcendental argument. My version of the transcendental argument is using the three transcendentals: goodness, truth, and beauty. Truth is really the only one you could make an actual argument for. Goodness and beauty are just things that, I think are important to think about. The three transcendentals, goodness, truth, and beauty. Jordan Cooper, very great Lutheran theologian, talks about this a lot. Goodness, truth, and beauty are all objective because they're all rooted in God's nature. That which is good is that which conforms to God's nature. That which is beautiful is that which conforms to God's nature. That which is true is that which conforms to God's nature. But goodness, truth, and beauty can only be objective if God exists, but everyone instinctively knows that goodness, truth, and beauty are objective, and especially truth. Because if truth is not objective, then the statement, truth is not objective, is that statement objectively true? If yes, objective truth exists. If it's not true, then objective truth exists. So I think you can argue just logically that objective truth exists, but I think because truth is one of those transcendentals, it cannot exist unless God exists. And I know you could pick that apart. There's criticisms of the transcendental argument. It's one of my personal favorites because I really do think that there are a lot of assumptions we take for granted. I really think that theology is the basis for science. That's why I prefer the transcendental argument to the cosmological argument. I don't think science leads us to God. I think God leads us to science because it really was the church that formed the basis for modern science. Yes, there was ancient Greek science, there was Islamic science, but modern science as we know it today was started by people who believed that the world was designed by an intelligent God, and that motivated them to study the world. Now, that doesn't, just because they believe that, doesn't mean God is real. It is possible that the church could have started science and then science ends up undermining what the church believes. That's what Alex O'Connor said in response to me. That is a possibility. I'm just saying I like the transcendental argument because I think these assumptions about God, I think theology precedes all the other sciences. Theology was called the queen of the sciences in the Middle Ages. So, yeah, I like that one. I also really like the ontological argument. Now, I don't use the ontological argument when I'm trying to talk to one of my unbelieving friends. If I talk to one of my unbelieving friends, I use the evidential argument and the moral argument. Because the ontological argument is very difficult to understand. It was articulated by Saint Anselm of Canterbury, and I think Anselm is one of the greatest theologians ever. I think he's my fourth favorite theologian behind Athanasius, Augustine, and John Calvin. St. Anselm was so based, he taught us so many cool things, and he founded medieval scholasticism. He disagreed with Thomas Aquinas, or rather Thomas Aquinas disagreed with him, because Aquinas was much later. Aquinas didn't like the ontological argument, but I favor Anselm over Aquinas. So the ontological argument basically says, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. If you think you can conceive of something greater than God, then that thing is God. Gavin Ortlund has a great video on the ontological argument, which I highly recommend. Gavin Ortlund from Truth Unites, another great YouTube pastor that I would highly recommend to everyone. So the ontological argument says God is defined as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Some people say it's the greatest possible being, but I think that than which nothing greater can be conceived is a better way to put it. And that means God is all-powerful, because a being who is all-powerful is greater than a being who is not all-powerful. It means God is all-good, because a being who is all-good is greater than a being who is not all-good. And it means that God exists, because a being that exists is greater than a being that doesn't exist. And you could say, just because we can think of such a being doesn't mean it actually exists. Well, actually, it does, because a being that exists in reality is greater than a being that exists in our mind. So there is such a thing as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now you could say, another response is, okay, what if I use this to argue for the existence of a perfect turtle, or a self-existent pizza? What if I say, like, my perfect pizza is a pizza which no greater pizza can be conceived? Well, the problem with that is that the definition of pizza implies limitations. I made a funny line in my video about the arguments for God that people seem to think was funny. If your pizza gets infinitely great, it'll turn into God. If your pizza has infinite size, infinite power, and is eternal, a pizza of infinite size and infinite eternity and infinite power, that's not a pizza, that's God. Okay? Same with the turtle. The definition of everything except God implies limitations. And there's been many different articulations of the ontological argument. There's Gödel's ontological argument with, like, mathematical proofs and stuff. I kind of understand it. I am a math student. That's mainly what I study. One day I hope to understand what he's trying to say. He uses, like, proofs logic about how certain things can be, like, vacuously true. I don't understand it enough to know if I like it or not. But generally speaking, the ontological argument is taken most seriously by mainstream philosophers of all the arguments for God. It's not that they necessarily believe in it, it's just the most well-respected, I believe. But now, in S tier, my favorite argument for God is the argument from mathematics. Now, I did admit that my video about responding to atheist arguments was a bad one. But I did make a different video about how math proves God, and a lot of atheists said that was bad. No, I stand by that one. There are things in mathematics that prove God beyond a shadow of a doubt, beyond the slightest shadow of a doubt. Now, even if we didn't have things like the Mandelbrot set or Euler's identity, I think the fact that math contains infinite information proves the existence of an infinite mind to contain that infinite information. Like, there's an infinite number of numbers. Where is all that information stored? And you could say those numbers aren't actually all real, those numbers are just things that we made up to explain the world, so there aren't actually an infinite number of numbers. There are only as many numbers as we can think of. But the thing that puts the nail in the coffin of that idea is the Mandelbrot set. The Mandelbrot set was clearly discovered by us. It was not invented by us. The debate in mathematics is whether math is invented or discovered. If it's invented, then that's not an argument for God, because math is just something we made. But if it's discovered, then who made math? And since math is infinite, then if it was created, it had to be created by an infinite being, if math is infinite, which math is infinite. So the Mandelbrot set, it's this shape with infinite complexity. It's not just one of those regular fractals where it repeats the same shape over and over again. The Mandelbrot set basically generates new complexity the more you zoom in on it. And you can zoom in forever and ever and ever, and you will never stop finding new things. Anytime you zoom in on the Mandelbrot set enough, you could see a shape that no human has ever seen before, and this shape is all generated by one simple equation. I don't like Answers in Genesis because they're a young Earth creationist, but they do have a good video about how this really displays the infinite mind of God. Broken Clock is right twice a day. So, yeah, the mathematical argument is great. There's also Euler's identity. Euler's identity, it was discovered by Leonhard Euler, one of the greatest mathematicians ever, and he was a devout Calvinist, like me, and he saw this as proof that God exists once he discovered it. There's like, the 5 most important numbers in mathematics are 0, 1, e,
true
I,
one.
and pi. For those of you who are not educated in math,